Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Usually when we examine how monumental shifts occur within, really long-standing institutions, we tend to look for an earthquake.
Right, like a massive explosion.
Exactly. We look for this massive, sudden rupture where the ground splits, the dust clears, and, the entire landscape is fundamentally altered overnight. We are basically conditioned to expect historical change to be loud, unavoidable, and instantly visible.
Yeah, we look for that French Revolution model of institutional change, where the turning point is just explosive.
Right.
But the actual mechanics of history,
Right.
and particularly religious and organizational history, they rarely operate that way. A seismic shift often begins with a really quiet, highly localized decision.
Just one person.
Yeah, one person sitting at a desk looking at the bureaucratic structure they inhabit and deciding they can no longer participate in its contradictions. And that individual choice sends a shockwave that, over decades, reshapes the entire environment.
And that slower, quieter mechanism of change is our focus for today's deep dive. We are pulling our insights from a primary source document. It's called a Memoir of Greville Ewing, Minister of the Gospel, Glasgow.
Yeah, compiled by his daughter.
Yes, Mrs. Jessy J. Matheson. And it was originally published in London in 1843, but the specific text we're analyzing is a 2017 reprint by Heart Press.
Right.
And our mission here is to extract the vital insights from Ewing's life. We want to understand how he transitioned from holding a highly prestigious, state-sponsored position within the Scottish religious establishment.
Which was huge back then.
Massive. How he went from that to pioneering a completely independent grassroots congregational movement across Scotland. And honestly, whether you're interested in church history, organizational leadership, or you just, love a story about a person standing by their principles against the grain, this deep dive is going to deliver some serious aha moments.
It really is. Because to understand the anatomy of that transition, we have to look at the environment that forged him.
Right, where he came from.
Exactly. The memoir is compelling because it gives us this granular look at a paradigm shift in 18th and 19th century Scotland. Ewing's early life presents this paradoxical blend of intense intellectual rigor and fervent experiential piety.
Which usually don't go together.
No. In most historical figures, those two elements are totally at war with one another. But in Ewing, they function as the engine for his eventual departure from the state church.
Yeah, the environment he was born into in 1767 was really physically and intellectually volatile. And the text details this specific event from his childhood that serves as a defining narrative.
The bridge.
Yes, the bridge. In 1769, Edinburgh was in the midst of massive civic expansion. Specifically, they were building the North Bridge. This is this huge engineering project designed to connect the old medieval city to the new town.
Right.
And when Greville was just 2 years old, his two older sisters took him for a walk across this newly constructed, though unfinished, structure.
Which is terrifying in hindsight, because they walked across the span, turned around, and returned to their father's house. And the memoir records that almost the exact moment they stepped inside their door, a massive section of the North Bridge suffered a catastrophic structural failure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The vaults and sidewalls just gave way. It collapsed into the valley below with a crash that was heard across the entire city, and it buried several people in the rubble.
That's chilling. Had those two young girls lingered for even a few seconds longer on their walk, all three children would have been killed.
Easily. And the psychological weight of surviving an event like that, by a margin of mere seconds, it inevitably shapes a family's internal culture.
Yeah, a narrow escape of that magnitude becomes foundational family lore.
Exactly. It creates a very specific type of survival narrative for a developing child. When a kid is raised hearing that they were spared from a highly public disaster by just seconds, it frequently instills a heavy sense of providential purpose.
Like they were saved for a reason.
Right. The child internalizes the idea that their life was preserved for a specific utility. It strips away the casualness of youth and replaces it with this baseline of seriousness.
That makes a lot of sense. So when we examine Ewing's later absolute commitment to his work, often at the expense of his own health and social standing, we have to factor in this early ingrained belief that he, owed a debt for his survival.
Precisely. And that seriousness was compounded by the adults raising him. The intellectual and spiritual DNA in his household was essentially split right down the middle.
Yeah, his father, Alexander Ewing, was a prominent math teacher in Edinburgh. He authored approved scientific works, but he was also deeply embedded in the Enlightenment debates of the era.
Very much so.
Like, he actively wrote and published pamphlets pushing back against the atheistic doctrines of figures like Thomas Paine.
Right. Alexander Ewing really represents the rationalist wing of 18th century religious defense. The Enlightenment demanded empirical proof, logic, reasoned argument.
Show me the math, basically.
Exactly. Alexander approached morality and theology as mathematical equations to be solved and defended. He was building intellectual bulwarks against what he perceived as the rising tide of rationalist skepticism.
So he provided Greville with an environment defined by critical analysis, debate, and the necessity of a sound, logical argument.
Yes, but then you have the other side of the coin. Because Greville's biological mother passes away when he's 6, following a grueling 14-month illness.
So sad.
And his father eventually remarries. And the stepmother operates on a completely different epistemology.
Right. She's not about the math.
Not at all. The text highlights that she had been converted by George Whitefield at the Orphan Park in Edinburgh. And Whitefield was one of the primary catalysts of the Great Awakening.
Oh, yeah. He was known for preaching in open fields to massive crowds, emphasizing a deeply emotional, visceral, and personal transformation.
So the contrast is just stark. Alexander Ewing defended religion from a desk with geometry and pamphlets. The stepmother experienced religion in a field through weeping and sudden emotional conversion.
It's like, if you want an analogy, it's like being raised by a data scientist and a grassroots activist.
That is a perfect way to put it.
How does a developing mind synthesize those opposing forces? You have empirical defense on one side and experiential faith on the other. Usually, a kid might reject one in favor of the other, like view the dad as too cold or the mom as too enthusiastic.
Right, but the synthesis of those two forces is exactly what made Greville Ewing so historically effective. From the father, he acquired the structural architecture of thought. How to exegete a text, how to spot a logical fallacy, how to hold his ground in a debate.
But from the stepmother?
From the stepmother, he learned that the intellectual architecture is useless if it lacks a beating heart. The memoir notes that he could remain stubborn in the face of his father's stern displeasure, but the gentle, earnest expostulations of his mother were, quote, invariably irresistible.
Wow. So he respected the math, but he was moved by the empathy.
Exactly. And there's this great anecdote from this period that highlights how this environment shaped his behavior. As a toddler, literally still wearing frocks, Greville enjoyed standing up and preaching as an amusement.
Just mimicking the intense oratorical environment around him.
Right. But what makes this relevant is how Ewing treated this memory as an adult. He did not romanticize it at all. He vehemently warned against parents interpreting a child's mimicry as a divine calling.
Yeah, he has that great quote. He stated, "One of the worst things in the world is a minister of his father's and mother's making."
And that statement really requires some historical context to fully appreciate. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, particularly in the Church of Scotland, the ministry was frequently treated as a pragmatic career track.
Like a trade.
Yes. A family might steer a son toward the ministry to secure social standing, a guaranteed state salary, and a respectable life, just like they would apprentice a son to a merchant or a lawyer.
So Ewing was forcefully rejecting that socioeconomic pipeline. He's basically arguing that inherited ambition is not a substitute for personal conviction.
Right, because if you enter a role that demands the management of people's spiritual lives based purely on parental pressure, you lack the internal fortitude required when the institution inevitably challenges you.
He wanted people in the pulpit who had experienced an enlightened, spontaneous choice, not actors playing a trade.
And his aversion to treating religion as a mere trade or rote performance was likely cemented by the specific church his family attended. They sat under the ministry of Old Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh.
Right, and Old Greyfriars was a collegiate church. Let's clarify that term for a second, because it is central to understanding his eventual crisis. What structurally constitutes a collegiate church in this era?
So a collegiate church meant that a single congregation and a single building were served by 2 ministers, and they shared the pastoral duties and the state salary.
So they would alternate the preaching schedule.
Exactly. At Old Greyfriars, one of the ministers was Dr. John Erskine, who was the recognized leader of the Evangelical Party within the Church of Scotland. The evangelical wing emphasized personal conversion, the urgency of the gospel, strict adherence to historic Calvinist theology.
So Erskine is preaching what Ewing's family would consider vital, urgent truth. But the other minister sharing the exact same pulpit is Dr. Robertson.
Yes.
And the memoir describes Robertson's tenure with a surprising level of hostility, calling it marked by dead inanity and ignorance of the gospel.
It does not hold back. Robertson belonged to the Moderate Party, which dominated the Scottish church at the time. And the moderates generally focused on polite moral philosophy, social order, and rationalism rather than urgent spiritual rescue.
So consider the cognitive dissonance this structure inflicted on a congregation. One Sunday, you listen to Dr. Erskine, who tells you that your soul is in peril and requires immediate radical intervention. And then the following Sunday, from the identical physical location, Dr. Robertson essentially delivers a polite lecture on civic virtue and moral decorum, implicitly or even explicitly contradicting everything Erskine said the week before.
The institution was funding and enforcing a theological stalemate.
Yeah, and if the institution forces contradictory truths to coexist simply to maintain the parish structure and the shared salaries, the structure itself becomes a primary objective.
Exactly. The message becomes secondary to the maintenance of the building and the bureaucracy. And for a mind trained by a mathematician to seek logical consistency, sitting in old Greyfriars was intolerable.
It taught Ewing that an institution's establishment, its wealth, and its social respectability do not guarantee its integrity.
Right. The collegiate system treated theology as theoretic dogma to be debated, rather than a cohesive reality to be lived. And that experience planted the seed for his eventual demand for structural purity.
He learned early on that the delivery system, like the vessel of the institution, can fundamentally compromise the message it's supposed to carry.
Yes, and that realization leads directly to his crisis of conscience. But it is so vital to note that he didn't rebel against the establishment because he failed within it.
No, he mastered the system before he dismantled his place in it. I mean, he completed his university studies, winning the first prize in the logic class.
Naturally, with his background.
Right. He was ordained and secured a position as a minister at Lady Glenorchy's chapel. By 1796, he was deeply embedded in the religious elite. He was the secretary of the newly formed Edinburgh Missionary Society and the editor of the Missionary Magazine.
He was a rising star with a guaranteed trajectory. To hold an ordained position in the Church of Scotland at the end of the 18th century was to hold a position of immense civic power.
He had it made.
He really did. He had a secure state stipend, social prestige, a powerful platform. He was insulated from the economic volatility of the era.
Which makes his decision in December of 1798 so difficult to comprehend from a modern career management perspective. At the height of his early success, he writes a letter to the presbytery resigning his charge at Lady Glenorchy's chapel.
Yeah. He formally states his duty to decline being considered any longer a minister of the Church of Scotland. So let's define the presbytery and what this resignation actually meant mechanically. Because he wasn't just changing denominations, was he?
Not at all. In the Presbyterian system, the presbytery is the regional governing body made up of ministers and elders. It controls ordination, theology, and crucially, the boundaries of where a minister is allowed to operate.
Okay.
So by resigning his commission to the presbytery, Ewing was stepping into an economic and social void. He was giving up his state salary, his recognized authority, his access to the traditional pipelines of influence.
He was rendering himself an absolute outsider in a society where the Church of Scotland dictated the rhythm of civic life.
Exactly.
But if he had this massive platform at Lady Glenorchy's chapel and the Missionary Magazine, why not just stay and reform the system from within? Like, why did he feel compelled to pull the ripcord on his entire career? The catalyst for his departure is found in his conversations with his peers, notably a Mr. Fuller. Ewing articulated that his grand motive was a burning desire to preach to the highways and hedges.
The highways and hedges.
Right. And that phrase exposes the mechanical flaw he saw in the Church of Scotland. The established church operated on a rigid parish system. A minister was assigned a specific geographic territory.
Okay, so you stay in your lane.
Very much so. It was highly irregular and often met with severe institutional discipline for a minister to cross into another parish to preach, especially if the minister of that neighboring parish was a moderate who opposed revivalism.
So the geography was dictating the theology. Even if a neighboring parish was suffering under the dead inanity of someone like Dr. Robertson, Ewing was legally and structurally barred from going there to offer an alternative.
Precisely. The institution was prioritizing its own bureaucratic boundaries over the actual spiritual needs of the populace. Ewing realized that the establishment was a bottleneck.
It was hindering the mission.
Yes. He wanted to reach those who were unserved or poorly served by the state church, and he realized he could not reach them upon the old plan. The delivery system was obsolete. He had to leave the architecture to do the work.
The reaction from the establishment is fascinating because it totally defies expectations. He isn't universally reviled as a heretic. There is this profound level of respect for his integrity, even from those he left behind.
Yeah, that's a really unique aspect of his story.
The text provides a quote from a Dr. Balfour, a minister who remained in the established church. Dr. Balfour loses a congregant, a friend actually, who decides to leave the state church and join Ewing's newly formed independent congregation.
And when questioned about this loss, Dr. Balfour replies, "Though it be a loss to me, yet it will be none to him."
That is a remarkable concession from a rival institution.
It really is. Dr. Balfour is acknowledging that while he regrets the defection, he cannot fault the theological or pastoral care the individual will receive under Ewing. It proves that Ewing's departure was not viewed as a cynical power grab.
Or a financial scheme.
Right. His opponents recognized that he was acting out of unfiltered conviction. He surrendered his wealth and status. No one could accuse him of ulterior motives.
So moving into this void, Ewing needed capital, allies, and a new structural framework. He was attempting to build a grassroots movement completely untethered from state support.
Which is incredibly daunting.
And the way he acquires one of his most significant partners introduces this incredible historical anecdote regarding a man named Mr. Aikman.
Oh, Mr. Aikman's trajectory is a perfect case study in how disruptive ideas bypass the traditional gatekeepers in this era.
It's so good. So Aikman is a young Scottish man operating in the colonial economy. He travels to Jamaica to take over a prosperous mercantile business left to him by his uncle. He's a pragmatic businessman.
Right, very focused on commerce.
And he decides to establish a circulating library in Jamaica, likely as just a side venture. He travels back to Britain to procure inventory for this library. While browsing a catalog, he encounters a book titled Cardiphonia, or Utterance of the Heart.
And he makes an assumption based on that title.
Yeah. Assuming based on the title that it's some dramatic romance or entertaining fiction suited for a popular library, he purchases it. He opens it expecting light entertainment, and the text completely dismantles his worldview.
It's like clicking on what you think is a mindless viral video, only to find a profound philosophical lecture that entirely changes your career path.
Yes, exactly.
The irony is profound because Cardiphonia was the furthest thing from a colonial romance novel. It was a collection of deeply introspective, rigorous spiritual letters written by John Newton.
John Newton, famously the author of the hymn Amazing Grace.
Right. And more importantly for Aikman, Newton was a former slave ship captain who had undergone a radical conversion and become a fierce advocate for experiential, heart-level theology.
So Newton's letters were exposing the exact kind of vibrant, urgent faith that Ewing's stepmother had modeled, and they collided violently with Aikman's life as a colonial merchant in Jamaica.
The mechanism of Cardiphonia is what matters here. It wasn't a dense theological treatise arguing about church governance. It was the utterance of the heart. It dealt with the internal reality of conscience.
So when Aikman reads this, the text awakens him to a deep concern for his own moral state. He returns to Jamaica, but he can no longer compartmentalize his business from the surrounding colonial reality.
The internal transformation makes his external environment intolerable.
Right. So he relinquishes his business to a partner, returns to Scotland, and aligns himself completely with Greville Ewing's movement.
And Aikman brings resources, energy, and a shared conviction to the cause. This really highlights the unpredictable nature of how Ewing was assembling his coalition.
The established church relied on a predictable pipeline, right? A man attends university, petitions the presbytery, and is granted a parish by a wealthy patron.
Very orderly. But Ewing's movement was gathering people whose lives were disrupted by books, by sudden realizations, and by an inability to tolerate the status quo. It was truly a coalition of the willing.
Having dismantled his ties to the old system and gathered these unpredictable allies, Ewing faced the most dangerous phase of any disruptive movement. He had to build a new architecture.
And this is where so many reformers fail. When a charismatic leader breaks away from a massive, flawed institution, the historical tendency is for that leader to become a dictator.
Right. They draft a hyper-specific manifesto, demand absolute ideological purity, and consolidate power to protect the new movement from fracturing.
But the text specifically emphasizes that Ewing was fiercely anti-sectarian. He actively refused the role of a party leader. He declined to issue anything resembling a new creed, a confession of faith, or a strict formula for his followers.
Yeah, he has this brilliant quote. He stated that he would rather read the Bible by the light of heaven alone than through the colored spectacles of any human system whatsoever.
The colored spectacles metaphor gets to the heart of his philosophy. He recognized that the moment you write a comprehensive creed or a statement of faith, you build a new lens.
And that lens begins to color how the text is read.
Exactly. Over time, protecting the creed becomes more important than engaging with the primary source material, which is exactly the trap the Church of Scotland had fallen into at Old Greyfriars.
Yeah.
Ewing wanted to strip away the intermediary lenses and force a direct, unmediated engagement with the biblical text.
Okay, I have to challenge the pragmatism of that approach, though. I mean, if you are building a new independent religious movement across a country and you completely refuse to enforce a shared creed or a statement of faith, how do you prevent the movement from instantly fracturing into 100 different chaotic factions?
It's a huge risk.
Right. How do you maintain theological coherence without the colored spectacles of a system to keep people in line?
Well, that is the structural vulnerability of congregationalism.
Mm-hmm.
The congregational model dictates that every individual local church is completely autonomous. They own their own buildings, hire their own ministers, govern themselves. They do not answer to a regional presbytery or a bishop.
So it could easily just evolve into chaos.
Exactly. To prevent that autonomy from devolving into theological anarchy, Ewing had to replace the enforcement mechanism of a creed with an incredibly rigorous educational standard. If you aren't going to tell ministers exactly what to think via a checklist, you have to train them meticulously in how to read and analyze the primary text themselves.
Which necessitates the creation of his theological academy in Glasgow. He becomes a tutor, but he completely re-engineers the mechanism of theological education. He abandons those cold, detached lecture halls of the university system where he and his father were trained.
Oh, completely. He built the academy on a foundation of radical, almost invasive hospitality.
Yes, we have this primary account from a medical student who attended this academy alongside future influential figures like Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Payne.
And this student's defining memory of the academy is not the curriculum or the exams. His defining memory is arriving in Glasgow, handing Mr. Ewing a letter of introduction, and immediately being absorbed into Ewing's private household.
The student records that Mr. and Mrs. Ewing insisted that all incoming students be their personal guests. They required them to live in their home for a full week upon arrival before finding their own lodgings.
A full week, just living with the tutor.
And even after they moved out, the Ewings hosted them for weekly dinners and provided what the student describes as almost parental solicitude.
This is a fundamental shift in the pedagogy of leadership training. By bringing students into his home, Ewing was dismantling the idea that theology is purely an academic exercise.
Right. In a university lecture hall, a student learns theology as abstract data.
But when a student lives in the tutor's house, they observe how the tutor handles stress, how he interacts with his wife, how he manages his finances, how he prays when he isn't behind a pulpit. Ewing was enforcing the idea that character formation is the actual curriculum.
Because if the congregational movement is going to survive without a top-down bureaucracy, the leaders have to be deeply empathetic, highly relational figures, not just brilliant logicians.
You cannot build a grassroots, community-driven movement with leaders who were trained in cold, competitive isolation. The hospitality was the mechanism for ensuring the new ministers possessed the emotional intelligence required for local autonomy.
But the intellectual rigor was still fiercely maintained, right? The student details Ewing's famous Lord's Day morning lectures on the Book of Genesis.
Yes, the student described these sessions as a fusion of enlightened criticism and impassioned appeal. Ewing was practicing expository preaching.
Meaning he's just going through the text verse by verse.
Right. Rather than picking a topic and finding verses to support it, he was taking the ancient text, applying the critical analysis he learned from his father, and driving it toward the experiential urgency he learned from his stepmother.
Synthesizing those two forces again.
Exactly. He was proving to his students that deep scholarship and emotional resonance are not mutually exclusive.
So armed with this new breed of trained, highly motivated ministers, Ewing and his allies, men like Mr. Aikman, Dr. Wardlaw, who had defected from the secession church, and William McGavin, they began an aggressive campaign of expansion.
They bypass the institutional red tape completely.
Yeah, they support itinerant preaching. They send traveling preachers to the furthest extremities of the Scottish map, places like the Orkney and Shetland Isles.
And the expansion into Orkney and Shetland is highly significant. The memoir points out that prior to Ewing's movement, Dissent had never been known in those regions.
Let's define dissent in this historical context. What does it mean for these islands to experience dissent for the first time?
Dissent simply means operating outside the legally established state church. In remote regions like Orkney and Shetland, the Church of Scotland held an absolute, uncontested monopoly.
So no competition.
None. The local minister was often the only educated authority figure, and the parish church was the only sanctioned venue for religious life. And because there was no competition, the pastoral care in these remote monopolies was often profoundly neglectful.
So Ewing's itinerant preachers were acting as a disruptive startup entering an underserved, monopolized market. They weren't asking permission from the local presbytery. They were just showing up in the highways and hedges and offering a more vibrant, demanding, and immediate form of faith.
And it was working. They were testing the limits of their new architecture, and it held up. It was a period of immense outward success and geographical expansion.
But historical narratives of institution building often gloss over the personal toll required to sustain that momentum. As we examine the final phases of Ewing's life, the outward triumph of the congregational movement is counterbalanced by devastating inward sorrow.
Yeah, maintaining a posture of defiance against the state while simultaneously holding together a fragile, emerging coalition requires an immense amount of psychological energy.
And Ewing is then hit with profound personal tragedies. The first is the death of his wife, Janet Jameson. And she wasn't a passive figure in the background. She was the co-architect of the Academy's radical hospitality.
She managed the household that incubated the next generation of leaders. Her death fractured the center of the community.
The loss of a spouse who is also a core operational partner is doubly devastating. Ewing is forced to process his personal grief while simultaneously managing the communal grief of his students and his congregation.
And his method for processing this loss is fascinating. He authors a memoir of her life. He explicitly states that his goal is to perpetuate her usefulness.
Wow, even in death, focusing on her usefulness to the mission.
Right. And the document was so resonant that a portion of it was actually extracted by the Religious Tract Society and published widely under the title, Right Preparation for a Journey.
So writing that memoir was a mechanism for survival for him. He took the unstructured, paralyzing reality of his grief and gave it a theological shape. By focusing the narrative on her usefulness, he ensured that her death wasn't merely an ending, but a continuation of their shared pedagogical mission.
He turned his private mourning into a public resource for his movement.
But the attrition of his inner circle continues. In 1832, he loses William McGavin, one of his earliest and most vital allies in the effort to establish the independent churches. And the circumstances surrounding how Ewing receives this news really underscore the relentless pressure of his role.
The timing is almost too precise to be believable, but it is documented fact.
It's crazy. Ewing is at his desk in Glasgow, engaged in the routine work of preparing his exposition for the upcoming Sunday. He's studying the 8th chapter of the book of Acts.
Right.
He reaches the 2nd verse, which reads, "And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him." Stephen, in the biblical text, is a foundational leader who has just been killed. At the precise moment Ewing is analyzing this verse about the burial of a leader and the grief of a community, a messenger arrives with the news that William McGavin has died suddenly.
The psychological shock of that convergence must have been staggering. He's literally studying the mechanics of ancient communal grief right as his own modern reality fractures.
A normal reaction would be to abandon the desk, cancel the sermon, and collapse into the loss.
Of course.
But Ewing does not stop. He takes the exact text he was analyzing, Acts 8.2, and immediately pivots it to become McGavin's funeral sermon.
It's incredible.
He channels the shock directly into his pastoral duty, preaching that McGavin, like the biblical Stephen, was a man full of faith and power whose loss required great lamentation.
This incident reveals the immense burden of pastoral leadership. To outlive your closest allies is a unique form of suffering. McGavin was the man who toured the country with him, who understood the specific, terrifying weight of leaving the establishment back in the 1790s.
Ewing wrote that he found in McGavin not a brother only, but a counselor and a father.
When those foundational pillars fall, the leader is left exposed. Ewing was the architect of this massive, thriving movement. Hundreds of congregations looked to him for stability, yet his own internal scaffolding was being systematically removed by death.
It requires a level of compartmentalization that is just difficult to fathom. He had to publicly perform the role of the comforter while his own support network vanished. But the memoir also records moments where the vast delayed dividends of his early sacrifices are suddenly made visible.
Amidst all the physical decline and the loss of his peers, he experiences this moment of transcendent validation involving a massive translation project.
Yes, and this is where we see the ultimate geographic and cultural reach of that quiet decision he made to resign from Lady Glenorchy's chapel decades earlier.
It all connects back to that desk.
It does. Ewing receives a visit from a Mr. and Mrs. Swan. They are returning missionaries who have spent years laboring in Asia. They bring with them a physical artifact, a completed translation of the Holy Scriptures in the Mongolian language.
A monumental achievement.
And they traveled to Glasgow specifically to place this finished volume directly into Greville Ewing's hands.
Because Greville Ewing's ecosystem, the academy, the independent missionary societies, the focus on reaching beyond parish boundaries is what equipped and launched them.
Just consider the chain of causality here. In 1798, a man decides he can no longer tolerate the contradictory, deadening structure of a state-funded collegiate church in Edinburgh. He forfeits his salary and his social standing.
Takes a massive risk.
Right. He starts teaching students in his own living room, demanding rigorous exegesis combined with urgent empathy. He inspires a generation to ignore geographic borders and take the message to the highways and hedges.
And decades later, because of that specific rebellion, complex ancient texts are translated into the language of nomadic tribes on the steppes of Central Asia.
It is the ultimate empirical proof that his rejection of the institution was not a mistake. When he held the Mongolian translation, he was holding physical evidence that his refusal to wear the colored spectacles of a local Scottish bureaucracy had facilitated a global exchange of ideas.
The text records that his gratitude in that moment was almost too great for his weakness to sustain. The validation physically overwhelmed him.
As his physical weakness increases in his final years, the communal structure he designed responds to care for him. The rigid, top-down institutions he left behind might have simply retired him and assigned a new man to the parish.
Very clinical.
Yeah, but in the congregational model, the relationships are permanent. The text highlights the intense dedication of a Miss Cathcart, a woman who essentially managed his daily life and health as he aged.
And the broader community recognized this invisible labor.
Yes, the female members of his congregation actually pooled their resources to present Miss Cathcart with a specialized writing desk and a pair of gold spectacles as a formal token of their gratitude for her relentless care of their aging pastor.
There is a profound poetry in that final detail. Ewing spent his entire adult life fighting against the colored spectacles of human systems and rigid institutional creeds. He demanded clear, unfiltered vision.
Wow.
And at the end of his life, the community he built out of that demand provides a literal pair of clear spectacles, given in love, to the woman ensuring his final days are safe. It brings his philosophy of relational, grassroots care full circle.
It serves as a perfect synthesis of his life's work. Greville Ewing was a man formed by Enlightenment logic and revivalist passion. He mastered the most powerful religious institution in his country, identified its structural fatal flaws, and walked away from its wealth and security.
He proved that an individual can dismantle an obsolete system not by shouting at it, but by quietly building a superior, more demanding, and more empathetic alternative.
Right. He demonstrated that true influence does not require a state mandate. By prioritizing hospitality, rigorous education, and the absolute autonomy of the local community, he built a resilient architecture that survived his own immense personal tragedies and reached across the globe.
The mechanics of his life present a direct challenge to anyone navigating modern institutions. It forces a practical inventory of our own environments. Like, where are you currently relying on the colored spectacles of a corporate culture, a political faction, or a rigid tradition to interpret reality for you?
Where are you silently accepting contradictory, ineffective systems simply because they provide a steady salary or social respectability? Are you willing to identify the bottleneck in your own industry and walk away from the establishment to build something that actually works?
It requires recognizing when the architecture of your life is actively preventing you from reaching your own highways and hedges.
Which leaves a final structural question to consider as we close this deep dive. We began by discussing the difference between explosive historical earthquakes and the quiet, localized decisions that actually reshape the world. History is aggregated from those small points of friction.
It really is.
So, if someone were to analyze the primary source documents of your career a century from now, would the narrative be defined by the massive, safe, contradictory institutions you managed to comfortably survive within? Or would your legacy be defined by the terrifying, uncomfortable exits you made in order to architect a better system?